Within minutes, the gentle tapping became a thunderous drumming as rain began falling in sheets so thick Jake could barely see the old oak tree that stood 30 yards from his front door. The wind picked up, howling through the valley like a living thing, desperate to tear apart everything in its path. Lightning split the darkened sky in jagged veins, illuminating the landscape in brief, stark moments that revealed the true scope of what was coming. The first drops came softly, almost gently, tapping against the tin roof of his barn with a rhythm that seemed harmless enough. Jake had weathered storms before in his 63 years of working this land, but something about the way the clouds rolled across the valley made his stomach tighten with unease. The cattle in the far pasture had already begun moving toward higher ground, their instincts sharper than any weather forecast could ever be. Some floods arrive with warning, but this one came like a thief in the night, carrying with it the power to destroy everything a man had spent his lifetime building. Jake Morrison stood on his weathered porch, watching the morning sky darken from peaceful blue to an ominous shade of charcoal that seemed to press down on his ranch like a heavy blanket. The air itself felt different, charged with electricity and carrying the scent of distant rain that would soon become something far more dangerous. Then Jake heard it, the sound that every rancher in flash flood country knows and fears, a low rumbling roar that starts distant and grows closer with each passing second. It was the sound of water moving where water had no business moving, carrying with it the accumulated fury of an entire watershed suddenly unleashed upon the land below. The creek that normally meandered peacefully through his property had transformed into a raging torrent in a matter of minutes. Jake watched in horror as the chocolate-colored water surged over its banks, carrying fence posts, dead cattle, and debris from upstream ranches that had already fallen victim to the flood. His own fencing began disappearing under the advancing wall of water that seemed to devour everything in its path, with an appetite that would not be satisfied. The water reached his barn, first swirling around the foundation before beginning its relentless climb up the wooden walls. Years of careful planning and hard work vanished beneath the surface, as equipment, tools, and feed supplies were claimed by the hungry current. But it was when Jake saw the water approaching the pasture where Thunder grazed that his heart truly began to race, because some things in life are worth more than barns and fencing and tools. The chestnut stallion stood in the distance, his powerful frame silhouetted against the storm, still unaware that his world was about to change forever. The stallion had been grazing peacefully near the old creek bed when the water arrived with the suddenness of lightning striking the earth. What had been familiar ground just moments before transformed into a treacherous maze of swirling currents and floating debris that seemed to appear from nowhere. Thunder's first instinct had been to run, as any wild creature would, but the flood had other plans for him. Some moments reveal the fragility of even the strongest creatures when nature decides to remind us who truly holds the power. Thunder had always been Jake's pride, a magnificent chestnut stallion whose coat gleamed like polished copper in the sunlight, and whose spirit burned as fierce as his name suggested. But now that same powerful frame trembled against forces beyond his control. A massive cottonwood tree, uprooted from somewhere upstream, came rolling through the water like a battering ram, its twisted branches reaching out like gnarled fingers to snare anything in their path. Thunder tried to leap clear, but the current caught his powerful legs, pulling him sideways just as the tree struck him with enough force to knock the breath from his lungs. The impact drove him against a tangle of fence wire and wooden posts that had accumulated against a rocky outcropping, creating a deadly trap that held him fast. The water continued to rise with each passing minute, climbing steadily up Thunder's chest as he fought against the debris that pinned him in place. His nostrils flared wide as he struggled to keep his head above the churning surface, his eyes rolling white with panic as he realized the true scope of his predicament. Every movement he made seemed to tighten the grip of the branches and wire around his body like some living thing determined to drag him under. Jake could see it all from his position near the barn, the way Thunder's powerful muscles strained against his prison, the way his breathing became more labored with each surge of the flood. The stallion who had once run across these fields like Thunder itself now found himself at the mercy of water that cared nothing for his strength or his will to survive. The debris field around Thunder grew larger as the flood brought more wreckage from upstream. Broken boards, sections of roofing, and tangles of barbed wire that made any rescue attempt increasingly dangerous. Yet Thunder continued to fight, his head held high above the water, his spirit unbroken even as exhaustion began to creep into his movements. Some decisions are made not in the mind but in the heart, and Jake Morrison felt his body moving toward the flood before his brain could catalog all the reasons why he should stay on dry ground. The icy torrent stretched before him like a living wall of destruction, carrying the accumulated fury of the entire watershed. But all Jake could see was Thunder trapped and struggling against forces that would not show mercy to man or beast. Jake knew that time was running out. With each minute that passed, Thunder grew weaker and the water grew higher, creating a race against nature itself, where the stakes were measured not in dollars or property, but in the life of a creature who had given him years of faithful companionship. The moment his boots touched the churning water, Jake understood the true power of what he was fighting against. The current seized his legs with the strength of invisible hands, trying to pull him downstream toward the rocky canyon where the flood disappeared into darkness. The water was shockingly cold mountain runoff, mixed with rain that seemed to leach the warmth from his bones within seconds of contact. His weathered cowboy hat, the same one he had worn for 15 years, became his anchor point in a world suddenly turned chaotic. When debris struck him from behind or the current spun him sideways, that familiar weight on his head told him which way was up and which direction he needed to fight. The hat had seen him through cattle drives and harsh winters, but never anything like this baptism by flood. Each step forward required enormous effort as Jake fought against water that seemed determined to claim him as another victim. Broken fence posts spun past him like battering rams, while sheets of corrugated metal surfed the current with razor-sharp edges that could slice a man open without warning. A propane tank from someone's upstream property bobbed past so close Jake could have reached out and touched it if he had dared take his attention away from staying upright. The cold began working its way into his muscles, making each movement slower and more deliberate. Jake could feel his strength being sapped by the water that surrounded him, but Thunder was still 30 yards away, trapped against the debris field that held him like prison bars. The stallion's head remained above water, but Jake could see the exhaustion in those dark eyes, the way Thunder's powerful neck strained to keep his nostrils clear of the surface. Jake pressed forward, using submerged fence posts and rocks as handholds when the current threatened to sweep him away. His boots found purchase on uncertain ground that shifted and gave way without warning, forcing him to constantly adjust his balance. The sound of the flood was deafening, a roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, drowning out his own labored breathing and the hammering of his heart. 30 yards became 20, then 15, as Jake fought his way across the flooded landscape. Each yard gained felt like a victory against impossible odds, but the hardest part still lay ahead, because reaching Thunder was only the beginning of what would prove to be the fight of both their lives. Some rescues begin with hope and determination, but quickly teach you that nature recognizes no difference between the savior and the saved when both are fighting for their lives. Jake's hands finally made contact with Thunder's powerful neck, feeling the trembling muscles beneath the wet coat as the stallion struggled against his prison of twisted metal and wood. But what should have been a moment of relief instead became the beginning of an even more dangerous dance between panic and survival. Thunder's eyes rolled white with terror when he felt Jake's touch, not recognizing his longtime companion in the chaos of rushing water and debris. The stallion's powerful hindquarters thrashed wildly, sending geysers of muddy water in all directions as his hooves carved through the current like weapons, seeking anything solid to strike against. Jake barely managed to duck as one of those iron-shod hooves whistled past his ear close enough that he could feel the displaced air against his skin. The debris field that held Thunder captive was a nightmare tangle of materials that seemed designed by some malevolent force to trap and destroy. Sections of barbed wire twisted around fence posts created a web that grew tighter with each of Thunder's movements, while branches from the massive cottonwood tree pressed against his ribs like prison bars. Jake could see where the wire had already begun cutting into Thunder's coat, leaving thin lines of blood that mixed with the floodwater and disappeared downstream. Jake pulled the folding knife from his pocket, his fingers numb from cold as he tried to work the blade through the tangle of wire and wood. Each cut required him to position himself dangerously close to Thunder's thrashing hooves, while fighting against the current that seemed determined to wash him away from his task. The water had risen another few inches since his arrival, reaching almost to Thunder's shoulders now and reducing the stallion's ability to keep his head clear of the surface. Working by feel more than sight in the churning water, Jake managed to cut through several strands of wire, but the debris field seemed to regenerate itself as quickly as he could dismantle it. Each piece he removed was replaced by more wreckage floating downstream, branches and boards and sections of roofing that the flood delivered with relentless efficiency. The current pressed everything against Thunder's body with tremendous force, making each small victory temporary at best. Thunder's panic began to affect them both, as his wild movements created waves that washed over Jake's head, forcing him to fight for breath while trying to maintain his grip on the knife. The stallion's powerful neck muscles strained as he lifted his head higher, seeking air that became more precious with each passing minute. Jake could see the exhaustion beginning to show in Thunder's movements, the way his struggles became less coordinated and more desperate. The cold was working its way deeper into Jake's bones, now making his movements clumsy and uncertain. His hands shook as he tried to position the knife blade against a particularly thick section of wire that seemed to be the key to freeing Thunder's hindquarters, but the current kept pushing him away from the angle he needed. Time was becoming their enemy, as surely as the flood itself, with each minute bringing Thunder closer to a point where even freedom might not be enough to save him. Jake realized with growing dread that his first attempt was failing, not from lack of effort, but from the sheer impossibility of the task before him. Sometimes salvation slips through your fingers just when you think you've grasped it, and Jake felt the cruel irony of progress stolen by forces beyond human control. As the floodwaters suddenly surged with renewed fury, he had managed to cut through nearly half the debris holding Thunder, when the water rose with frightening speed, as if some distant dam had finally given way to the relentless pressure building upstream. The surge hit them both like a liquid avalanche, carrying with it the accumulated power of miles of watershed, suddenly unleashed upon the valley below. Jake felt his feet swept from under him, as the current grabbed both man and horse, dragging them downstream toward a section of riverbank that had collapsed under the flood's assault. Thunder's terrified whinnying was lost in the roar of rushing water, as they were pulled inexorably toward what looked like a brown scar carved into the earth itself. The collapsed bank created a natural trap where the current slowed and deposited its burden of silt and debris, creating a thick sucking mud that seemed alive with malevolent purpose. Thunder struck the mud bank first, his powerful hindquarters disappearing into the viscous mess that clung to him like quicksand. The stallion's front legs churned desperately against the surface, but each movement only seemed to pull him deeper into the earth's hungry embrace. Jake fought against the current, trying to reach Thunder, but found himself being pulled into the same muddy trap that held his horse captive. The thick silt grabbed at his boots and legs with surprising strength, as if the earth itself had developed an appetite for destruction. The mud was not like ordinary soil, but a mixture of clay and organic matter that had been churned by the flood into something that defied every attempt to find solid footing. Thunder's breathing became increasingly labored as the mud crept higher around his powerful chest. The stallion's eyes held a desperate intelligence, as if he understood that this trap was different from the debris field, more final and unforgiving than wire and wood. His struggles grew weaker, not from lack of will, but from the simple physics of exhaustion, meeting immovable resistance. Jake could feel his own strength ebbing as the cold water and thick mud conspired to drain every ounce of energy from his aging body. His hands shook uncontrollably, now making it nearly impossible to maintain his grip on anything solid, while the hypothermia crept through his system like poison. Each breath became a conscious effort, as his body began shutting down non-essential functions in a desperate attempt to preserve core warmth. The mud around Thunder continued to rise with each passing minute, fed by the relentless current that brought more silt and debris to add to the growing prison. Jake realized with growing horror that they had moved from a rescue situation to something far more desperate, a race against time, where both rescuer and victim faced the same inevitable outcome unless something changed soon. Both man and horse had reached the breaking point where courage and determination were no longer enough to overcome the simple, brutal mathematics of nature unleashed. Some moments force a man to weigh his own life against something larger than survival, and Jake Morrison felt that terrible mathematics settling into his bones as surely as the cold that was slowly claiming his body from within. The hypothermia had moved beyond discomfort into something more sinister, making his thoughts fuzzy and disconnected while his muscles refused to obey the commands his mind desperately tried to send. His fingers had lost all feeling, turning blue-white beneath the muddy water as circulation failed in his extremities. The shivering that had racked his body earlier had stopped completely, which Jake knew was a dangerous sign that his core temperature had dropped to critical levels. Each breath felt like swallowing ice, while his heart struggled to pump blood through vessels that were constricting in a desperate attempt to preserve what warmth remained. Thunder's condition had deteriorated just as rapidly, with the thick mud now reaching his neck, forcing the stallion to stretch his powerful head skyward in an increasingly desperate attempt to keep his nostrils above the sucking surface. The horse's breathing had become shallow and rapid, the telltale signs of an animal whose body was beginning to shut down under the relentless assault of cold and exhaustion. The cruel irony was not lost on Jake that they had both survived the violence of the flood, only to face a slower, more insidious death in this mud trap that seemed designed by nature to mock their earlier struggles. Thunder's eyes still held that fierce intelligence, but Jake could see resignation beginning to creep into their depths, as if the stallion understood that some battles cannot be won through strength alone. Jake felt his own grip on consciousness beginning to slip as his body diverted blood away from his brain in a final desperate attempt to keep his vital organs functioning. The edges of his vision grew dark and fuzzy, while his thoughts became fragmented echoes of themselves. He knew that he was facing the moment every rescuer dreads when continuing the mission means certain death for both savior and victim. The choice crystallized before him. With brutal clarity, he could use his remaining strength to try to reach higher ground and save himself, or he could stay with Thunder and likely die alongside the horse he had spent his life caring for. It was not really a choice at all, because some bonds transcend the simple mathematics of survival, cutting deeper than logic or self-preservation. Jake pressed his numb hand against Thunder's neck, feeling the stallion's pulse racing beneath the cold skin, and made his decision. If this was to be their final chapter together, then he would write it on his own terms, refusing to abandon the creature who had given him years of faithful companionship. When the stakes were nothing more than morning rides across peaceful fields, sometimes miracles arrive not as divine intervention but as the sound of diesel engines cutting through despair. And Jake Morrison felt his fading consciousness pulled back from the edge by the unmistakable rumble of heavy machinery approaching through the storm. Through the haze of hypothermia and exhaustion, he heard something that seemed impossible: the deliberate sound of a tractor fighting its way across flooded ground toward the collapsed riverbank, where he and Thunder faced their final moments. Tom Henley had been watching the disaster unfold from his own property, a quarter-mile upstream his experienced rancher's eye, tracking the flood's path of destruction with growing alarm. When he spotted Jake's distinctive cowboy hat bobbing in the muddy water near the collapsed bank, Tom didn't hesitate to fire up his old John Deere and load it with every piece of rope and chain he could find. Because some situations call for action over careful planning, the tractor's arrival transformed what had been a death sentence into the first glimmer of hope Jake had felt since entering the floodwater. Tom worked with the efficiency of a man who had spent decades dealing with emergencies on the ranch, his movements economical and purposeful as he positioned the heavy machine on stable ground above the mud trap. The diesel engine provided an anchor point of mechanical reliability in a world that had been ruled by chaos and unforgiving natural forces. Tom's plan was simple in concept: but dangerous in execution. They would use the tractor's winch system to create a mechanical advantage that could overcome the mud's grip on Thunder. But the timing had to be perfect. The stallion's strength was nearly gone, his breathing shallow and irregular, as the mud continued its relentless climb toward his throat. They had minutes at most before Thunder would be unable to help in his own rescue. Working together in the kind of wordless coordination that only comes from years of ranch experience, Jake and Tom secured the rescue harness around Thunder's chest. The stallion barely reacted to their touch, a sign that his reserves were nearly depleted, but his eyes still held that flicker of intelligence that suggested he understood help had arrived. Jake could feel Thunder's heartbeat through his palm, weak but steady like a distant drum calling him back from the edge of surrender. The first attempt to extract Thunder from the mud failed, as the suction proved stronger than they had anticipated. The tractor's engine strained against the load, while Thunder's hooves scrambled uselessly against the slick surface. Unable to find purchase that would allow him to contribute to his own rescue, Tom adjusted the angle and tried again, the mechanical whine of the winch cutting through the storm's fury. Time compressed into individual heartbeats as they fought against physics and exhaustion. Jake positioned himself in the mud beside Thunder, using his remaining strength to guide the stallion's movements, while Tom operated the controls with surgical precision. Each inch gained felt like a victory against impossible odds, while each slip backward threatened to undo their progress. Thunder's breathing grew more labored with each passing second, but something in the stallion's spirit seemed to respond to the mechanical assistance, as if the sound of the engine had awakened reserves of strength he didn't know he possessed. Sometimes the difference between triumph and tragedy comes down to a single moment when everything that matters distills into one final desperate push against forces that seem insurmountable, and Jake Morrison knew they had reached that moment as Thunder's eyes began to show the glassy sheen of a creature approaching the edge of consciousness. The mud had crept to within inches of the stallion's nostrils, while his breathing became increasingly shallow, each exhale weaker than the last, as his body prepared to surrender what his spirit refused to give up. The harness around Thunder's chest had been secured with the kind of desperate precision that comes when failure means death for all involved. Tom's weathered hands worked the winch controls with surgical delicacy, while Jake positioned himself beside Thunder in the sucking mud, using his own body as a guide and anchor point for the stallion's movements. The diesel engine's steady rumble provided a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to pulse through the chaos, offering rhythm and hope in equal measure. Jake could feel Thunder's muscles trembling beneath his palm, not from cold alone, but from the enormous effort required to remain conscious, as hypothermia and exhaustion conspired to shut down his systems one by one. Yet somewhere deep within that magnificent chestnut frame, something stirred when the winch engaged a primal recognition that survival required partnership between horse and human that transcended individual strength or mechanical advantage. The first pull from the tractor created a barely perceptible shift, as Thunder's body rose perhaps an inch from the mud's grip. But that small movement seemed to awaken something in the stallion's spirit. His ears flickered forward for the first time in what felt like hours, while his powerful hindquarters bunched with effort. As muscle memory overrode exhaustion, Jake felt it through his hands pressed against Thunder's neck. The moment when the horse decided to fight alongside his rescuers, rather than simply endure their efforts. Tom increased the tension gradually, allowing Thunder's own movements to work in harmony with the mechanical pull rather than fighting against it. The stallion's hooves found purchase against submerged rocks and debris, his powerful legs driving upward with strokes that spoke of ancestral memory when horses ran wild across open plains. Each movement was labored and uncertain, but carried within it the essence of what had made Thunder magnificent long before flood and mud tried to claim him. The extraction became a symphony of coordinated effort, where human determination, machinery, and animal instinct combined into something greater than the sum of their individual parts. Jake guided Thunder's movements, while Tom operated the winch with the sensitivity of a musician playing a delicate passage, where one wrong note could shatter everything they had built toward this moment. Thunder's front legs broke free, first his powerful shoulders emerging from the mud with a sound like the earth itself exhaling. The stallion's head lifted higher, his nostrils flaring, as he caught his first full breath in what seemed like eternity, while his eyes cleared with renewed awareness of his surroundings. Jake felt tears mixing with floodwater on his cheeks as Thunder gathered himself for one final surge that would either carry them all to safety or mark the end of their shared struggle against forces beyond mortal control. The moment stretched into eternity, as everything they had worked toward balanced on the knife's edge between salvation and loss. Some bonds are forged not in moments of joy, but in the crucible of shared suffering, where two souls discover what they mean to each other. When everything else has been stripped away, Thunder stood on solid ground for the first time in hours, his chestnut coat matted with mud and his powerful frame trembling from exhaustion, but alive in ways that transcended the simple act of breathing. Jake leaned against the stallion's neck, feeling the steady rhythm of a heart that had refused to surrender even when surrender seemed like the only rational choice. The physical scars would heal in time, the cuts from barbed wire would close, the bruises would fade, and the hypothermia would release its grip on Jake's aging body. But the emotional imprint of their battle against the flood had carved itself deeper into both man and horse. Thunder's eyes held a new weariness, a recognition that the world contained forces beyond his control or understanding, yet also carried within them a deeper trust in the human who had risked everything to pull him from the mud. Jake found himself changed, as well marked by the knowledge that he had been willing to die for a creature who could never thank him in words, but whose very presence in his life had given it meaning beyond the simple accumulation of days. The flood had taken his barn, his fencing, and most of his equipment, but it had also revealed something he might never have discovered otherwise, that love sometimes requires risking everything for the chance to save what matters most. In the days that followed, as the waters receded and the cleanup began, Jake and Thunder moved through their routines with a different rhythm. The stallion stayed closer to the house, now as if understanding that safety was not something to be taken for granted, while Jake found himself pausing in his work simply to watch Thunder graze, grateful for the sight of an animal at peace in his own pasture. The bond between them had been tested by forces that cared nothing for human sentiment or animal loyalty, yet had emerged stronger for having survived that testing. They had looked into the face of their own mortality together and chosen to fight side by side against odds that should have claimed them both. Some connections run deeper than blood or breeding, deeper than training or familiarity, forged in moments when everything else falls away except what truly matters. Thunder would carry the memory of the flood in his bones, just as Jake would carry it in his dreams. But they had also gained something precious: the knowledge that neither of them faced the uncertainties of life alone. If this story touched your heart and reminded you why the bond between humans and horses is something truly special, please hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales of courage, loyalty, and the unbreakable connections that make life worth living. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.